On October 17, 1988, three people went up to the Chestoa View overlook on the Blue Ridge Parkway, about 2.5 miles south of Linville Falls in North Carolina. Only one person, 37-year-old James Clifton Gibbs, survived this trip. His wife, 30-year-old Helen Gibbs, and her best friend, Susan White Haire, age 32, died from their injuries. Investigators immediately became suspicious of the two women's deaths, and after learning of the troubled marriage between the Gibbses, arrested James Gibbs and charged him with murder. It would take 2 years and 2 trials in 2 different towns before a jury could finally reach a verdict. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 156, Helen Gibbs and Susan Haire, Deaths on the Parkway. The North Carolina mountains are a beautiful place to visit, but we've had many occurrences of people getting lost on hikes or getting injured or falling off treacherous spots or overlooks. In episode 105, I shared the story of a group of hikers who got lost outside of the Linville Gorge, a hiker who fell to his death off a nearby trail, and a woman named Frances Apperson who went missing in 2022 after hiking in the same area. Frances has since been declared dead, but her body was never found. When park rangers were notified of a possible fall back in October of 1988, especially off Chestoa View, they probably weren't surprised. The overlook rests atop a 1,600-foot drop into the gorge below. It's an isolated area, but visible to passing cars. To get to the overlook, one must park in a secluded parking lot, then walk down a winding stone path. It's a gorgeous spot, but not somewhere to be horsing around, which is what James Gibbs said his wife and her friend were doing when they fell. James and Helen Gibbs were from Fayetteville, and Susan Haire was living in Ladson, South Carolina at the time of her death. The deaths occurred around 8 p.m. that Monday. According to James, the three had gone to the overlook so they could take a few sunset photos. They were vacationing with their 3 children, ranging in age from 13 to a toddler, and Susan's 2 daughters, ages 13 and 2. The children were waiting for the 3 adults back in Spruce Pine at the Skyline Motel. The initial media reports quoted Park Ranger Russ Whitlock as saying, "He turns around, leans down to pick up his tripod and camera. He hears a commotion behind him, and by the time he turns around, his wife and the good friend of the family are already down over the overlook falling." James said the 2 women were messing around on the 2-foot stone wall surrounding the overlook when he turned around to pick up his camera. They must have fallen. He said he climbed over the overlook to help them and blacked out until hearing generator motors from the rescue party a few hours later. So how did the Forestry Service know that an accident had occurred in the first place? 2 men from Illinois and Indianapolis were vacationing in the area, and they stopped at the Chestoa View overlook around 7 p.m. that evening. They walked down the trail with flashlights and found a camera bag and tripod on the last step leading to the overlook. They immediately grew suspicious. As they used their flashlights to scan the immediate area, they heard a woman's voice call out, "Oh, my arm," and then a man's voice. The men, Mike Mallory and James Manning, got into their car and drove 10 miles south of the overlook to Gillespie Gap, where they told a park ranger about what they had seen and heard. Rescue crews discovered the body of Helen Gibbs around 3 a.m. on October 18th, about 400 feet below the overlook. Her body was found directly below Susan's. Around 3:05 a.m., the rescuers heard James Gibbs shouting for help. They reached him around 4:50 a.m. and treated him for his injuries on the scene. He asked one of the people helping him to call the hospital and inquire about his wife's condition and to tell her that he loved her. He had not yet been told his wife and her friend had been found deceased. But as investigators looked more into the 2 women's deaths, the more suspicious they became of James Gibbs. They noticed he only had minor injuries and suspected he may have fallen only 10 to 20 feet as he tried to climb down the cliff beneath the overlook. Also, James said the group went to the overlook to take sunset photos with his camera. But the overlook faced east, making a sunset photo impossible. Jack Knowles, a Fayetteville insurance agent for the Woodmen of the World organization, told the media he had contacted the U.S. Marshal Service about Helen's previous injuries from her husband on October 21st because he feared a less than sufficient investigation into the two women's deaths. He said he had received information about Helen's hospital visit from people who knew the Gibbs family, but he wouldn't specify which members. Helen Gibbs grew up Helen Burnett in Robeson County, the fifth of 7 children. She was studying nursing at the Fayetteville Technical Institute in 1978 when she first met James Gibbs. In fact, it was her friend Susan Haire who introduced the two. James worked as a factory worker at the Springfield Tire Company in Fayetteville. Helen was a single mom when the two met, raising a 4-year-old son from a previous relationship. After she and James married, they had 2 more sons, ages 1 and 7 at the time of her death. Eventually, Susan Haire had moved to South Carolina, taking a job in the maternity ward at Trident Regional Medical Center in Charleston. She taught Lamaze classes and had 2 daughters, ages 13 and 2. At the time of her death, she was single. On November 8, 1988, a McDowell County grand jury returned 2 murder indictments against James Clifton Gibbs. The McDowell County Sheriff, Bob Haynes, said James and Helen had been having marital difficulties at the time of her death, and that he stood to cash in on a $100,000 life insurance policy Helen had taken out on herself in the summer of 1988. James told investigators he didn't know about the policy, that he only knew about a $50,000 policy she had through the Army Reserves. The News and Record reported that at the time of these indictments, a Superior Court judge ordered the release of Helen's treatment records from Cape Fear Valley Medical Center in Fayetteville. These records were related to a visit she made to the hospital on August 22, 1988. Prosecutors also issued a subpoena for Cumberland County Mental Health, Division of Adult Services records, and tape-recorded or written statements made by Helen Gibbs. Once these hospital records were released to the public in mid-November of 1988, they did not paint James Gibbs in a good light. Helen had visited a Fayetteville hospital in August and told the medical professionals who examined her that James had burned her with what she thought was a cattle prod at their home. She was treated for burns all over her body. The reason why James burned his wife with the cattle prod was because he was trying to get the name of a local doctor she'd had an affair with in the past. After the incident, he went to Helen's sister, Catherine Locklear, and provided her with a tape he'd recorded of a conversation between Helen and Susan Haire. He confessed he'd secretly recorded the phone call because he was looking for information about his wife's affair. A detective with the McDowell County Sheriff's Office, Robert Smith, said he'd spoken with a coworker of James. This coworker had ordered 2 books from the police science section of Paladin Press and given them to James. The titles were Crime Scene Search and Physical Evidence and Never Say Lie, a publication focused on administering polygraphs and how to manipulate the machines. These publications were later found during a search of James's home. He'd asked another coworker about stun guns and how they worked. He told other coworkers that he was looking for a hitman on behalf of a friend who wanted to kill his wife. James said this friend was willing to pay up to $10,000 for the job. Because the deaths of Susan and Helen seemed accidental at first, their bodies did not undergo autopsies. In early December 1988, a Superior Court judge ruled the 2 women's bodies could be exhumed to determine the nature and extent of their injuries. Helen was buried at a cemetery in Robeson County and Susan in Cumberland County. In late December, a judge denied bond for James Gibbs for the 2nd time. He was ordered to remain in jail until his trial, which was moved from Marion to Newton due to the publicity. On June 6, 1989, the trial began in Newton, North Carolina. District Attorney Alan Leonard said James Gibbs had a secret plan to push the women to their deaths on October 17, 1988. He believed Helen was having an affair with another man, and he blamed Susan and didn't like that she knew the intimate details of their marriage. He announced they would be seeking the death penalty for James. A social worker testified that Helen's family tried to convince her not to file for divorce from James that May. At the time, Helen's mother had no idea James had burned Helen with what turned out to be a stun gun. James was emotional during the opening arguments and wiped tears away from his face a few different times. His defense attorneys told the jury that Susan Haire had been suicidal at the time of the women's deaths. Helen Gibbs' mother testified that she talked to her son-in-law by phone after he'd been arrested. She asked him to tell her what had happened. He said, "If Helen had told me that her affair had been over for 8 months, then this thing would never have happened." In January of 1988, Helen and James had sought out marriage counseling at the Cumberland County Mental Health Center for counseling. She went back alone in May of that year for another session. She told the counselor she was unhappy in the relationship and felt there was a lack of affection on the part of her husband. He, in return, felt that his wife didn't love him anymore and that they were only staying together because of their 3 children. The jury heard the testimony of a woman named Loretta Coleman, who worked with Helen at the VA hospital in Fayetteville. At the time, Helen was the head nurse of the cardiology-neurology ward. While the 2 women were sitting in the hospital cafeteria in August 1988, Loretta noticed burn marks on Helen's chest that she couldn't conceal. When she probed further, Helen admitted her husband had burned her with what she thought was an electric cattle prod. Upon further examination, a doctor determined Helen had been burned more than 50 times on her torso, arms, legs, and neck. She said James had held her down on their bed and forced her to confess about the affair, which had ended in December of 1987. After attacking Helen with the stun gun, James moved out of the family home for about a week. Helen worked with a lawyer to draw up a separation agreement. But after about a week, she called the attorney back and asked him to drop the proceedings. She said she wanted to give the marriage another try for the sake of their children. James's defense attorneys wanted to play a taped recording for the jury, which would have shared a conversation between Helen and Susan, where Helen said she knew James would fight her for custody of their 3 children if she left him. The judge in the case would not allow the tape to be played. James and Helen had vacationed in the mountains annually during their marriage, and for 3 years, Susan Haire and her children had gone along with them. But Helen was nervous about the October 1988 trip. While James had moved back into their home, the 2 were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Helen told friends she was afraid to go on the trip because she would have to share a bed with James. James Manning, the visitor from Indiana who'd reported his findings at the Overlook the night Helen and Susan died, testified about hearing a man and woman's voice as he turned his flashlight on over the gorge. He said the woman seemed to be screaming as loudly as she could, and then it trailed off in intensity as if it was getting farther away. Detective Robert Smith testified that he'd initially requested an autopsy be performed on both women. He didn't learn they hadn't been performed until he received the report from Dr. Dorwin Kroom. Kroom told the court he didn't perform the autopsies because he'd been told the deaths were accidental. The detective said there was at least a 1/4 inch of dirt underneath Susan's fingernails when her body was recovered, and plants had been uprooted just above the ground where she was found. On this day of the trial, jurors learned James had changed his story about what was happening when the women fell from the Overlook, depending on who he was talking to. He told Detective Smith he'd turned his back to adjust the camera and tripod, but he told Helen's sister Catherine that he'd been at the truck when he heard a scream. Catherine said James told her Susan had gone into the woods to pee, and when she came back, he and Helen had just kissed. He said Susan teased them about it, and Helen teased her about having pee on her shoe. He then went to put the tripod in the truck and heard one scream, then something hitting the bushes. So where was the camera and tripod? The parking lot is not directly adjacent to the Overlook. You have to walk back up a trail to get there. The 2 men who came along after the women fell said they saw a camera and tripod on the Overlook. Because no one was around, they grew worried. A doctor that treated James Gibbs at Sloop Memorial Hospital testified he was surprised at the lack of injuries on the man. Authorities had told the doctor James was found 150 feet below the Overlook. While James complained of soreness all over, Dr. Wayne Martin said he found only an egg-sized pump knot on his forehead and a nickel-sized abrasion on his left cheek. James's defense attorney, Ronnie Mitchell, pointed out that Susan Haire had attempted suicide in 1986 by taking an overdose of sleeping pills and had a history of abusing prescription medication. Her mother told the media Susan had been having trouble with a boyfriend and took the pills to get his attention. When questioned, Robert Smith said that although he knew of Susan's history of prescription drug use, he didn't request a drug test during the autopsy. Ronnie Mitchell told the court Susan had taken out a life insurance policy through Liberty Mutual Insurance Company on August 22, 1988, for $125,000, and had set up another policy through Massachusetts Indemnity Company. After her death, Liberty Mutual paid out the policy to Susan's two daughters and her sister. At the time of the trial, Massachusetts Indemnity was refusing to pay out that policy. Helen had purchased a $100,000 policy through Woodman of World Life Insurance on May 11, 1988, a few months before Susan purchased hers. The chief medical examiner for North Carolina, Dr. John Butts, testified about the results of the autopsies of the two women after their exhumations. He said each woman died of a brain hemorrhage. Helen had 2 broken ribs, a fractured left femur, and various cuts, scrapes, and lacerations all over her body. He noted Helen also had a dislocated elbow, which the doctor said would be painful to someone who was conscious. Was that elbow injury connected to the voice James Manning had heard screaming about her arm below the overlook? Helen had extensive bruising on the backs of her arms and hands and on her back. Susan also had a fractured left femur, a fractured collarbone, a fractured hip, and various cuts, scrapes, and lacerations, and a small hemorrhage on her vocal cords. Neither woman had traces of alcohol in their systems. Dr. Butts said based on information given to him by McDowell County law enforcement, he asked Dr. Dorwin Kroom to change the manner of death on the death certificates for both women from accidental to homicide. He did this before the December autopsies. At the trial, the doctor said he couldn't determine from the autopsies whether the two women had been pushed or fallen to their deaths. James Gibbs did not testify on his own behalf. In fact, his defense attorneys called no witnesses at all. Jury began deliberations on Friday, June 16, 1989. At 10:30 a.m., they announced they were deadlocked, 8-4. By 5 p.m., the jury, which was comprised of 8 men and 4 women, hadn't reached a verdict. The judge ordered them to return Monday to continue deliberations. But on that day, the jury remained deadlocked once again. 2 jurors believed there was not enough evidence presented to convict James Clifton Gibbs of double murder. The judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. He refused to set bail for James's release and ordered he remain in jail until his next trial. After the jury was dismissed, one of the jurors said the group should have been allowed to visit the overlook where the deaths occurred. They had requested the visit, but attorneys for both the state and the defense couldn't agree on the terms for the trip, so it never happened. Juror Jeff Korn said, "I think if they had gotten to see the area, the ones in doubt, I think it would have been better. A lot of them couldn't get in their minds how he got down there." Juror Kay Harris Ball said she believed the mistrial was a mistake. "I feel like he was a jealous man who took his wrath out on his wife," she said. Before we continue, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. I had been unhappy with my old podcast host for a while and was looking for other options. I discovered Riverside FM and learned that for one low monthly fee, it would help me record the podcast and utilize video capabilities. It uses AI technology to easily create clips from each episode that I can share on my social media accounts. I don't consider myself very tech savvy, but audio and video editing with Riverside FM software has been a breeze, and I actually look forward to recording days now. If you're looking for a company that will help you with all your podcasting, webinar, and video needs, I encourage you to check out Riverside FM. You won't be disappointed. I'll include a link for you in the show notes. After several years of using the products, I'm still singing the praises of the SkinX Aaron products offered by Midnight Riff. I love Aaron Sanderson's skincare line so much, I became an ambassador so I could earn a small commission off telling everyone just how much I appreciate the pre-cleanse oil, hydrating beauty oil, and perfecting night oil. My skin is acne-free, even in the throes of perimenopause, and looking brighter and more youthful than ever. And don't just take my word for it. Here are a few recent reviews from other people who love the products just as much as I do. Leah says, "I have been using the 3-piece set for a few years now. I can't live without it. It is truly the holy grail of skincare. My skin is so soft and healthy. I'm a lifelong user. I love it." Another user wrote, "I love this oil. I'm 47 and my skin soaks it up. I've been using it for many years now, so it's like hot sauce. I use it on everything. Itchy knees, cuts on my hand, my daughter's dry lips, and of course, my face. Now I'm ready for the groupie-sized gallon bottle." On average, the oils last around 3 months, and despite their names, they won't make your skin oily. Try them out for yourself with my code MissingCarolinas10 for 10% off your order. And now, let's get back to the show. The Charlotte Observer ran an article titled "Overlook's Tragedy Draws the Curious" in June of 1989. They interviewed an employee at the Blue Ridge Parkway Center about 3 miles away from the Overlook where the two women died, and she said visitors were curious about Chestoa View. The employee, Ava McKinney, said, "They want to know where the two ladies were killed. A lot of people drive up here to see it, from Winston-Salem, even from out of state. Sad and unfortunate, that's all I can say about it." The reporter also spoke to a visitor from Indiana who said, "I'd just heard people say so many things I wanted to see for myself. Some people said there's no way you could fall accidentally, and others say there is." An article that ran in the News and Observer while James was awaiting his second trial provided more of an inside look into the Gibbs home. Friends and family told the reporter that James had always been supportive of Helen as she pursued her nursing degrees and took over more of the housekeeping and care of their children. Helen's sister Catherine wondered if that's why James was so opposed to the idea of divorce, because he was losing a vested interest in the family he'd helped to create and support. James's employers at Kelly Springfield Tire described him as a focused and productive worker. His coworker, Terry Sessoms, was shocked when James approached him about hiring a hitman to kill Helen because it seemed so out of character. But Helen's mother also painted a different side of James. She said that he'd often belittled Helen for having a child out of wedlock and for being Lumbee Indian. On April 30th, 1990, James Gibbs' second trial began in a different venue, this time Hickory, North Carolina. His defense team focused less on defending James and more on pointing the blame on Susan Haire, Helen's best friend. Sigrid White, Susan Haire's mother, testified that her daughter was in good spirits 6 weeks before she left to go on vacation with James and Helen Gibbs. But the defense team pointed out Helen Gibbs told family she'd also considered suicide in the past, and Susan once jokingly told her the two could jump off the Cooper River Bridge in Charleston together. A witness for the defense, suicide expert Dr. Ronald Maris, said the most likely scenario for October 17, 1988, is that Susan meant to end her life by jumping off the Overlook, and Helen Gibbs fell accidentally. Susan's ex-boyfriend, a cosmetologist from South Carolina, testified that Susan took a near-fatal overdose of antidepressants in 1986 when he turned down her offer of marriage. James Gibbs testified on his own behalf this time. On June 8, 1990, after deliberating for 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty in the 2 counts of murder James Gibbs had been charged with. On June 8, 1990, after deliberating for 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty in the 2 counts of murder James Gibbs had been charged with. The jury foreman told the media, "Maybe he did do it, but we just never seen enough evidence to convict a man of murder. If he did, he'll be judged later on." Reactions to the verdict were mixed, of course. James's family was elated, while Helen's family was devastated and tearful. Helen's father told reporters a murderer had just been turned loose. We'll never really know what happened that day on Chestoa View. There are people that have gotten away with murder in similar fashion. But James Gibbs was tried by a jury of his peers twice and was found not guilty. At this point, that is where this case stands. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this case. Let me know in the social media comments. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. All episodes are researched and written by me, Renee Robertson, with sound editing provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.